I'm excited to have Frazer Rice today. Frazer and I have known each other for over 20 years. I know he's got one of the most interesting wealth advisory businesses out there, but after 20 years of friendship, I've actually never stopped and asked him, what makes your business unique? I know it's very unique. Frazer's someone who's literally written a book on wealth.
Mike, thanks for having me on. It's a treat to be on your show, and one of the early ones here. From a wealth management perspective, definitely bring a bunch of different things to the table with my background. I wrote a book. I have a podcast myself, and writing the book helped me really synthesize a lot of my experience and guide what I think is important. And then the podcast for me is a great way to talk with people like you on a variety of different topics within the wealth management space, so that I can get 85% smart on a lot of things. And then when I need to bring in the real expertise to solve for a client issue that comes across the door, then I know what we're up against.
Understood. So you've got a really unique platform at Next Capital. Maybe you could walk us through why your platform is helpful and how you differentiate yourself from, say, a Goldman Sachs or Morgan Stanley or a independent registered investment advisor.
Sure. So from my perspective, I really deal with the tax and structuring side of things. I think in my experience and in the experience of the firm here, coming at it from different places, we've looked at a lot of different family situations, and the threats to wealth really aren't smart people, intelligent tax planning, good investments. Those are everywhere. You can find those at Goldman. You can find those at independent RIAs. I think that the real crux of the matter is that there is a lot of institutional knowledge in between the ears of the client. And there's a lot of smart people that help them, but ultimately the planning, the paperwork, the sort of ethos that's to be passed on to the next generation ends up in a drawer oftentimes. And what we've tried to build here at Next is the concept of bringing that to the fore, codifying it periodically, and making sure that not only is the advice getting implemented or thought of and implemented, but that it gets executed and revisited within a year, within a couple of years at a set time frame, so that when there are things like tax law changes, or one of the kids gets married, or there's been a death in the family, or when there's kids, that the plan is understood by everybody and that we can make changes and pivots so that we can take advantage of opportunities and steer away from risks.
Got it. So it's not just set it and forget it. It's a living plan that you're on top of and monitoring. We deal with founders, and we invest in founders, and we understand how founders create their wealth, but you're helping them take that wealth that they've built, protect it for themselves and their family, and doing it on an ongoing basis.
That's right. And it really starts even before, a liquidity event or anything like that. We try to get the founders to understand what their situation is currently, make sure that any sort of transaction that they're thinking about does what it needs to do in terms of protecting their standard of living both now and in the future. And then we try to help out when in the sales process and helping them understand what a great after-tax result looks like, knowing who the buyer is and making sure that from a sort of subjective perspective that the post-transaction environment is what they hoped for. And then hopefully, as we start to get around things, certainly around the trust planning and the estate planning and after tax planning, that we're also able to help them think about what the values are that they want to transmit to the next generation in addition to the assets, because that next transfer is really where you start to see where the estate plan hits the road. And if you haven't really thought about the why of the estate plan and how to communicate that, that's where we really see some wreckage pile up.
So that sounds like legacy to me. So what do you think is important around those legacy and values?
Well, I think the first thing is to think about it. A lot of people sort of go through the exercise of an estate plan and generational planning with the idea that it's a transaction and that it's something to get done and then move on with the next things you want to do in life. I think the families that take legacy seriously and make it and incorporate it as part of their overall sort of life plan, they stand a better chance of mitigating the risks associated with generational fighting, going backward, having big drawdowns in the portfolio, threatening their standard of living, those types of things.
Have you seen that where you had somebody with a generational wealth and a big drawdown, you saw that impacting them in real time and maybe you had to help them fix that situation?
Oh, no question. I've seen lots of scenarios where people either on the investment front, they ended up over concentrated in some
Mm.
ways and believed that the tire company was going to live on forever and ever and that it would continue to throw off dividends when that wasn't the case. And suddenly you have to have difficult discussions with both current and future constituencies about what is and isn't possible there. To the same extent, we also deal with people who, they've had different scenarios where you've had conflict where some parts of the family wanted to grow an asset and other ones wanted to derive the income from it. And that's sort of a natural tension in generational planning, is making sure that all of the constituencies understand the choices that are made, especially around family businesses that founders create, so that there isn't misunderstanding as to why things are set up the way they are. And then, ultimately, when good joint decisions have to be made, that the first bite at the apple from a decision-making standpoint isn't at the point of maximum stress. And in my opinion, those 2 points are when you sell the family business or when the founder or the generation one finally passes away.
Yeah, and we really look at those founders and understand how those founders have built the wealth. And I guess one of the tensions that you have to help them explore, and you're probably a really good advisor on this, having gone through it, is when do you have that family or that founder take their foot off the gas of creating wealth through the concentration in this very productive asset? But when is the time to take the concentration for the wealth production? And when is the diversification for the wealth preservation?
Well, I'll tell you, if there was an easy answer to that, I'd be replaced by AI tomorrow. But
Well, I knew there wasn't an easy answer, and I wanted to let you and your comprehensive background really shine on it. So that's really why I'm giving you the hard questions.
Sure. No, so let me answer it this way, which is first, I think it's important to respect the mindset and the attributes that make founders successful, and that we're not going to necessarily convert somebody at a specific point in time from wealth creator to, let's call it a more passive enjoyer of wealth or wealth preserver. So really the way I try to think about it is to create scenarios where there is a place in the overall plan where entrepreneurism continues to be encouraged. And frankly, the values that power entrepreneurism are powered to the next generation and transferred to the next generation, because it's those things that help maintain standards of living. And you end up fighting shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves where people get lazy at the next generations and just sort of enjoy the wealth. By the same token, the education process is to go to the founders and say, look, what happens if? And there's a lot of scenario analysis that goes into the concept of, what if this doesn't work? What if you can't take as much money out here? What happens if NVIDIA or OpenAI suddenly makes your software company, not what you think it's worth? And so by painting the pictures of, what does upside look like? What does downside look like? And what is the benefit of diversification in preserving, not just you founder, but you founder's family, you founder's legacy, all of those different longer term constituencies, so that, you don't have, you don't run into a pothole that causes a real potential to go backwards, because there's no family situation that I can think of that really enjoys the concept of minus 40% and can we live on those assets.
Yeah, I don't think that sounds fun to anyone. And really what you're doing is difficult. And I think about Microsoft as a great example, right? Bill Gates had advice from probably the greatest ever, right? Buffett. Buffett encouraged him to diversify, which he did, and certainly no one's arguing with Mr. Gates' wealth. But Mr. Ballmer did not diversify and ended up having even more wealth. So these decisions are not one size fits all. They're very different for every person. And I can envision someone like you who's worked with individuals like that over a very long period of time. You have some good insights on how to guide them based on their goals and their values.
Yeah, so to take the Microsoft example where you have Gates and Ballmer, I position also, those are great examples. You have somebody who diversified, you had someone who stayed concentrated, both were successful in a variety of different ways. There was also the idea of Kodak, which at the time was similar. And frankly, when it finally went belly up, it had a whole bunch of digital IP that, if changed and sort of managed differently, could have probably been somewhat competitive in a modern technological society. But a lot of the family members depended on Kodak, and a lot of people believed in keeping that company. And when it went down 94% initially, there were a lot of lifestyles that were impacted. And, part of the education process is to say, here's where it goes right and here's where it goes wrong. And going wrong and not preserving the wealth, not preserving the standard of living, not preserving the legacy that you're building, that's what I really try to fight against. And by, mitigating that, or at the very least, if I can't fix, somebody's mindset, at least they understand and are educated about why they got to the decision they did. That I can go to sleep feeling good at night, knowing that, someone made a good decision with the best data they had possible. That's really what we're trying to do.
I think that makes sense, right? There is no crystal ball. And so we have to take our experiences and best known data at the time and choose a plan. And then all the way back to your values, those values are going to impact what's important to people because, as you mentioned, some people have values on growing the assets. Some people have values on cash flowing the assets, and it's balancing those. And to your point, it's probably a good idea to have the founder, where they're still in charge, getting that balanced to prevent infighting. So maybe two questions that I'll let you handle one at a time.
Sure.
Where should someone start working with you in the monetization or growing cycle of their business? And so let's do that as one, and then let's close that out, and then let's come back. When should sort of the viewpoint of their heirs or their children or their beneficiaries be brought into the discussion?
So the first question I would say as soon as possible. You certainly don't want to be a distraction to a founder. They've got a lot going on. They have their head down. They are performing Herculean tasks in order to make a business successful against dozens and dozens and dozens of headwinds. But that said, you need for them to allocate a little bit of attention to what it looks like post-business, post their involvement, post their family's involvement, if for no other reason than to be a better founder themselves. Because if they can take themselves out of it or envision a world where the business has to live without them, I think they're ultimately going to create the processes that make a better business overall. That includes things like solid boards, good management systems, operational and ownership succession plans. Those two can overlap, but they are two very different things. To not have those in place, I think really sets yourself up for difficulty. So then to segue into your second question, which is when do you start thinking about heirs and next generations and things like that? Again, I don't think it's too early to think about it, but I think from an education standpoint, I think when the kids start to get into the sentience moments of their lives, when they start getting into their 10 and 11s, they have a little bit of experience with math, they have some socialization experience, you have some data as to what the aptitude is of the kids and their interest level. So you can start to see if one kid looks like, well, they're going to go in the Peace Corps, whereas this person's going to be an investment banker, or this person, I could really see them being a leader and someone who could drive the business. That data sort of input that you are receiving on your kids that's when you really, I think, need to start thinking about the succession of the business and the wealth, if there is no business, and to say, okay, who's good at what, who's interested in what, and what are the danger signs that are out there? And then it's just an iterative process as kids develop, because, as they take as their lives continue to evolve, they're going to make mistakes, some permanent, some not permanent. They're going to have successes, some permanent and not permanent. And then there are going to be times when you think they're going one way and they completely change their mind. And this is all before the introduction of spouses, which is a totally different thing that you can't plan for when they're 10. You don't know who they're going to meet and what they are and what they aren't. And then they're kids. So it gets back to the notion of having an iterative process where you go through and say, look, here's the wealth. Here's the type of wealth. Here's what I can expect it to cash flow. You worry about making sure that your situation is taken care of at the first generation level. And then as you start to take in data, you start to understand what you have to worry about in terms of the next generation. And then you start to build the structures around that so that they're a combination of both durable and flexible. You want them durable so that it keeps away creditors and the bad guys and the tax men and all that to the extent they can, but flexible so that they can adjust and adapt to life, which is an ever-changing ball of lightning that comes at you when you least expect it, and creates a whole new set of scenarios that, many times you can't envision 10, 20, 40 years beforehand.
I think that's really a key point, and I'm glad you brought it up, is durable and flexible is probably really where you earn your insights and your advisement, in that if you only are durable, eases the complexity. If it's highly flexible, but both of those could really go into the ditch quickly. So keeping it maintained between those two endpoints, that to me seems like where you're really providing your insight.
Yeah, a lot of that is balance. And so, you need the durability in order for the structures to stand up and withstand tests. But you also need flexibility because at the point in time when you create them, you're doing the best you can with the data that you have, but that data is going to change and those conditions are going to change, and, in dozens of different ways. So the ability to be able to adjust the planning to the extent that you can is important. To go all the way to one side or the other, I think it creates something that's ultimately pretty flimsy and doesn't work. You end up in an area where it doesn't stand up to challenges real well on either side, and that ultimately is in service to no one.
Yeah, I think, you've got such a unique background, and we touched at it very high level, but I'd like to go a little bit deeper now and bring it to how your solution is unique in how you coordinate a standalone CPA, how you coordinate with a tax lawyer, how you bring it all together. And frankly, your unique aspects of your background, I think it was, a decade or two at Wilmington Trust, law, even some politics, being an author. How do you pull those all together to help create that durable yet flexible plan?
Well, so maybe I'll just go into my sort of the arc of my background, which might help listeners and watchers a little bit. So worked in politics coming out of college, worked in New York State. So you get to see a lot of how the world works in terms of dealing with on the ground constituencies and votes and projects getting done and how that works. I did what other lost souls do, and I went to law school, and I had kind of a broad base of experiences at the SEC and the Federal Reserve, and with an entertainment lawyer of all things when I was down in Atlanta. And so you get to see a lot of different types of issues, both sort of regulatory to business and in terms of negotiation and things like that. Finished that up, passed the bar, came up to New York, practiced for a couple of years. And so that was, you see how, operating in a law firm works and that type of thing. And then I worked for Wilmington Trust for almost 16 years. And so I really cut my teeth and learned wealth management from the ground up. And in a sense, what being a fiduciary with a capital F looks like. I think there's a lot of noise around, put your interests above others. And yes, that's great. And I would say everybody kind of does that who's in the wealth management business. Fiduciary with a capital F is when you are a trustee and you are essentially liable for everything that happens. And if it doesn't work, you're on the hook. And operating in that environment, obviously with support and so on, is an interesting viewpoint from it. I kind of think that a law degree in some ways is a great training, issue spotting, solving problems, being confident in front of important people, that type of thing. But it's also a little bit dangerous in the sense that, in the wealth management world, you can get very caught up with spotting issues and, I'm not sure we can do that and so on. So, between the, sort of the politics and getting things done no matter what, to wealth management and law, where you sort of say, how do we do things from a risk standpoint in a risk adjusted way? That's an interesting balance. And then, in order to keep my blade sharp in many ways, I wrote a book on wealth management and have a podcast around it. And that's how I stay current and how I stay interested around people who are smarter than I am with broad circumstances, so that when a particular piece of business crosses my desk, there's very little that I haven't had some exposure to. I'm not saying I'm an expert in everything by any stretch, but I feel like I've got a logic or a wisdom and a common sense about how to get to a solution and do it in a way that is very protective of the client and ultimately is able to, get all of the cats in a knapsack and, going in the same direction so that we can execute. There's a lot of parallels between wealth management and say, trying to get a bridge built or, a business started in New York State where there are lots of headwinds and tongue in cheek there. But all of that brings to bear just sort of a wide background and a wide sense of sensibility in order to help get a client where they need to go.
Makes sense. I think we're just a few minutes left, so maybe just maybe a little bit more on your book for people, to learn a little bit more. Hopefully, a lot of our viewers have the ability to bring on an advisor like you. But for people that are newer in their career and thinking about where they want to go, or just to learn a little bit more about you, maybe just touch on a few highlights from the book and what you learned writing it and what you've learned since it's been out in the public and you're getting feedback on it.
Got it. So the book, it's almost 8 years old at this point, or maybe it'll be, about that coming up in August. And writing the book was a thrill. I was able to take what was between the ears and really synthesize what was important to me. Then the next step was to make it palatable. It's one thing to sort of think you're interesting and then write the driest piece of toast out there and no one cares. And I kind of made the decision to make it very sort of anecdotal and letter to the editor oriented. And I think a lot of people who read it have found that to be pretty useful. And so, there's a not only the expertise, but making the expertise accessible, which has helped make me a better advisor in many ways, being able to think and get concepts down on paper and then put it into a form that's presentable for people to digest. And, very early on, someone told me, have a robust table of contents because no one's going to read the whole book, but they're going to go in there and look at the things that they're interested in and take bits and pieces from that. And so if people do that, I consider that to be a pretty big success. I think for people who are entering the industry, there are lots of resources and ways to get smart about investment management and law and trust and estates and things like that. I think an interesting sort of underrated group that I'm involved with is the Private Directors Association. And these are people who are aligned with founders most often. In private businesses before they go public, obviously. But there is so much experience in there with founders worried about different facets of their business and surrounding themselves with people at the board of director level that have insights, have unique ideas, et cetera. I've interviewed a few of them on my podcast and I learned something every time. But the idea of surrounding yourself with expertise and getting to a solution, I think is great. I think as much experience people can get in being around joint decision making and how multiple people can fuel a decision and then getting that decision into implementation and action, that ultimately is what's going to make you a great advisor and someone that is relied upon by important people with lots of resources.
Makes sense. And so for anyone who needs services like yours, I guess they find you at Next Capital is the best way to go about that?
Yep. 2 ways to get me. Nextvantage.com, which is next-vantage.com, and wealthactually.com. And I'm also on LinkedIn. And frankly, if you Google me, I'm not hard to find.
Awesome. Well, this was fun. Like I said at the beginning, Frazier, we've known each other for a long time. I knew you were dealing with founders and generational families, but I'd never really taken the time to learn what you're doing. It's super interesting, and I hope we get to chat more about it later.
It's great stuff. And when you said 20 years, my heart palpitated slightly. Time marches on, but it's great to watch your success. And the Founders ETF story is really cool. So I watch with great interest. And thanks for having me on.
Great to have you.